All right, we are going to start reading the Cambridge Ancient History. It is a several volumes, and they're all pretty long. And the idea here is that we are going to read it very slowly and very carefully. And my main channel, the main thing I do, is teach English. So I'm going to assume that the people watching this have an intermediate level of English. Therefore, when we see complicated words or phrases, we will look at them very carefully, examine them very carefully, and talk about interesting vocabulary words. But even if English is your first language, I think that this might be an interesting thing if you're interested in history, because we'll be reading each paragraph, but then kind of considering it more closely or putting it in simpler terms every time and getting a better understanding of the history. That's kind of the point of doing this, because I love to learn about history. And if you love to learn about history too, then you might enjoy this sort of in depth examination of each paragraph or each sentence, or taking apart the words with me. So I don't know what I'm doing. I just think this might be fun, so we'll give it a shot. All right, this is the Cambridge Ancient History, Volume 1, Chapter 1, Primitive Man in Geological Time. Okay, now I've never read this before, so anything that I talk about, I'm just guessing. But you know, when you see this word geological, that means it has something to do with the earth. Whenever you see that word geo, that means it has something to do with the earth or the ground beneath your feet. And so they're saying primitive man in geological time. So my guess is they're going to talk about very early humans, the first humans, and the only evidence that they have is inside the ground in the earth. So I think they're going to explain to us what they know or what kind of evidence they have of early humans based on what they can find in the earth. Okay. And then we have this subtitle here, the setting of the stage. When you see that phrase, the setting of the stage, that means they're going to, it's kind of hard to explain setting the stage. They're going to prepare you for later things. So they're just going to give you a little taste or a little introduction to more complicated things. When you set the stage, you're just sort of preparing people for what is coming. All right, so let's get started here. History, in its common and more popular sense, is the study of man's dealing with other men. Okay, so what they're saying is what history is, their definition of history is how do people interact with each other? How do people treat each other? What do that's what they mean by man's dealing with other men. They mean history is just about how people interact with each other and the adjustment of working relations between human groups. So history is people interacting with each other and also how groups interact with each other. But there is a larger sense in which human history merges in natural history. So now we're getting to the geological part. So they're saying, but there's merge means come together. So we've got these two things, how people interact with each other and what we can find, the physical evidence that we can find in the earth. Oh, now I've lost my place. But there is in a larger sense in which human history merges with merges in natural history and studies the dealings of man with nature. And it may be observed that it has been only by slow degrees that any human group has attained to such vision of the unity of mankind or of the civilization as might constrain it to regard other human groups. Okay, well, this is complicated the way that they're writing this. Let's see, I think we have to read that again. And it may be observed that it has only been by slow degrees that any human group has attained to such a vision of unity of mankind or of civilization as might constrain it to regard other human groups as more than peculiarly intractable element in its own natural surroundings. Okay, wait, now we have to stop for a minute. Intractable. I'm not even sure what that means. Let's see. Intractable. Let's look up that word. Intractable. Let's put that up here. I'm just going to write that. Let's see. Okay, here it is. Intractable. So we'll put that up here. That's a pretty fancy word, intractable, and that means hard to control or deal with. Intractable. Well, how is that used here? Peculiarly, that means strangely. Strangely hard to deal with element in its own natural surroundings. Okay, well that's actually, that's a really hard sentence. So we're already off to a pretty difficult start here. Let's take another look at that. Okay, so, but there is in a larger sense in which human history merges in natural history and studies the dealings of man with nature. And it may be observed that it has been only by slow degrees that any human group has attained to such vision of the unity of mankind or of civilization as might constrain it to regard other human groups as more than a strangely hard to deal with element in its own natural surroundings. That's a really weird sentence. I'm not even really sure myself what they're saying here. Because they start by saying, okay, history is people dealing with people, and it could also be people dealing with nature. And then they go off into this other thing. It may be observed that it's been only by slow degrees that any human group has attained to such vision of the unity of mankind or of civilization as might constrain it to regard other humans more than a peculiarly intractable element in its own natural surroundings. All right, well, I think for the moment, let's keep going. Maybe it will become clearer as we go. An austere conception of war. Okay, let's get a definition for austere, which kind of means like serious, but let's just get the official definition here. Severe or strict attitude or appearance. An austere conception of war, a very strict conception of war, that under certain circumstances, right has no court of appeal, but might survives to remind us that man has not yet wholly rid himself of this confusion between things and alien persons, and the most modern conception of international right so far accepts this fact of an alienation between the higher functions of human groups, however reasonable, as to take differences of language, of the medium that is for interchange and reconciliation of ideas as the best guide when and where for the present it is safer to keep human groups apart and let them manage their affairs as far as possible, each in their own way. Wow, that's really complicated. But what they're saying, very simply, is that their view is that separate people should remain separate because they have different ideas and they should be left alone to do things in their separate ways. Because differences in language, or what did they mention? They mentioned language. Okay, I think we better examine some of this. So, an austere conception of war, that under certain circumstances, right has no court of appeal, but might. Okay, right and might. There's a saying, isn't there? Like, or they usually, might means like very strong. So, you usually see these words together, right? Like you're right, or might equals right, or something like that, right? Like the stronger you are, the more right you can be, because nobody can argue with you if you're strong. Right has no court of appeal, but might. So they're saying that strength is more important than being right. Survives to remind us that man has not yet wholly rid himself of this confusion between things and alien persons. So alien persons, that means foreigners. And the most modern conception of international right so far accepts this fact of an alienation between the higher functions of human groups, however reasonable, as to take differences of language, of the medium that is, for interchange and reconciliation of ideas as the best guide when and where, for the present, it is safer to keep human groups apart. So they're talking about language is a way that reconciliation means like if you're fighting, to reconcile means like to make up or to get along. So using language for reconciliation means using language to repair relationships. And for interchange, like interactions or dealings or business or cooperation. So as to take differences of language, of the medium that is, for interchange and reconciliation of ideas, as the best guide when and where, for the present, it is safer to keep human groups apart and let them manage their affairs as far as possible, each in their own way. Okay, history in the narrowest sense of all, as the interpretation of written evidence for arrangements made for right living within a human group or between such groups, accepts implicitly the same criterion. So history in the narrowest sense, narrow kind of means like small. This is wide and this is narrow. So history in the narrowest sense. So history in the most basic sense, or the simplest sense, or the simplest way of thinking of it, as the interpretation of written evidence for arrangements made for right living within a human group. So history, this is really hard actually, even for a native speaker. These histories, I think this is about 100 years old, this book, and the way it's written is pretty complicated actually, even for a native speaker. Okay, so history in its narrowest sense, and the most basic idea of history is the interpretation of written evidence for arrangements, maybe deals or business, made for right living within a human group or between such groups, accepts implicitly Let's get a definition on that word implicit. Implicit. Okay. Well, the official definition of implicit is implied, though not plainly expressed. So that means like understood. Let's put the word implicit up here just for a minute so you can see it in big letters. Implicit. Okay, so this is kind of like understood. Not said, but everybody understands it. Let's see. Let me get rid of that now. Okay, history in the narrowest sense of all, as the interpretation of written evidence for arrangements made for right living within a human group or between such groups, accepts implicitly the same criterion. And criterion is like requirement. So we understand this is a requirement. Nobody has to say it. Everybody agrees or understands. This is a requirement. What is that requirement? That and stop short where such evidence. Oh, wait a minute. Is not available. So most history, they're saying, is based on writings like agreements or dealings with people, maybe legal agreements or something like that. That's, I think, what they're saying. History, in the narrowest sense, is the interpretation of written evidence for arrangements for business made for right living. So that seems to be like maybe about laws or morals or something like that within a human group or between such groups. So, and accepts implicitly the same requirements, and everybody understands these requirements, and stops short where such evidence is not available. So they're saying most history is based on written agreements, either between people, inside cultures, or different civilizations, and between civilizations, or between countries, or between groups. And without that evidence, there isn't much history. Okay, let's see. Linguistic paleontology goes a little further. Now that's weird, because my understanding of the word paleontology is like the study of bones or something. Let's see if I'm right. Paleontology. Yeah, well, okay, not bones necessarily, but with animal fossils or plants. But I wonder what linguistic paleontology. So that's why I'm wondering what linguistic paleontology is. Let's see. Linguistic paleontology, because how if paleontology is the study of fossils, then what is linguistic paleontology? The practice of making inferences about the cultures of language users on the evidence of reconstructed languages is called linguistic paleontology. So they study ancient languages, maybe languages people don't use anymore, and they guess certain things about the behavior of people or the practices of people based on those languages. All right. Linguistic paleontology goes a little further back in the study of the distribution of intercommunicant groups and of such relations between them as loanwords or structural likenesses in the speech may suggest. So loanwords in a language, that's when one language takes words from another language. So, for example, I think the French say weekend. It's not French, it's English, but they use it. So you can call that a loan word. Lots of languages. Japanese takes a lot of loan words. So does English. But I think now a lot of non English languages borrow a lot of words from English, like in French. Okay, so let's see. Uh, and of such relations between them as loan words or structural likenesses in the speech. Uh, so they study languages and they learn a lot based on some languages having loan words. Like which languages do they borrow from? Or structural likenesses. Which languages have similar grammar? But the spoken word does not fall to the ground. Like the spent missile or the broken vessel. When you say something is spent, that means it's been used up. So if you have a missile that's spent, it's no good anymore. Somebody launched it, it exploded, and now you just have the empty shell of the missile. The spoken word does not fall to the ground like the spent missile or the broken vessel to be its own memorial of human achievement. It vanishes in the air. And so the philologist deals with originals. What's a philologist? I'm sure it has something to do with language. Let's see. Philologist. A philologist is someone who studies the history of languages, especially by looking closely at literature. If you're fascinated with the way English has changed over time, from Beowulf to Beloved, you might want to become a philologist. Okay. So a philologist deals not with originals, but at best with the reminiscence of an echo. So what they're saying with the spent missile or the broken vessel is, you know, if you go into the earth and you find these things, it's evidence of how the world was 1,000 years ago or whatever. But that's not what happens with language, because they say language vanishes in the air. It disappears in the air. So it's really hard sometimes to study language because it's not physical. And it easily disappears. Words easily disappear or change. So the philologist deals not with originals, but at best with reminiscence of an echo. So reminiscent means kind of remembering of an echo. They're just, I think, trying to be poetic here. I think they're just trying to show you that it's really hard to reconstruct languages because they're spoken more than they're written, and they change in strange and interesting ways. To recover, therefore, what men were doing or making, still more, what they were thinking or desiring before the dawn of history, the sole available method is that of the archaeologist. So the archaeologist is the person who goes into the earth and finds evidence of, in this case, human behavior or human culture or something like that. Merging as it does with the geologist. So a geologist studies Earth, and an archaeologist studies, at least in this case, studies human behavior or human cultures based on what you can find in the ground. And they say that merges, they come together, because the geologist studies the earth, the ground, the land, and the archaeologist studies what's in the ground. Since these alone handle and interpret original creations of men's thought and will, and contemporary elements of the physical surroundings of those men, where the tree falls, there shall it lie, and where the lost implement or shattered potsherd or worn out man fell, there have they lain. That's a potsherd. I mean, I guess it's related to the word shard, which means like a little piece, a little broken piece of glass or clay. But I've never heard sherd before. Could just be old-fashioned English. Potsherd. A broken piece of ceramic material, especially one found on an archaeological site. And we have a worn-out man fell. So let's see, let's read that again. So where the tree falls, there shall it lie. Meaning, if a tree falls, it doesn't move. So even 1,000 years later, if you dig up the ground and you'll still find the tree right there. Or let's see, or where the lost implement or shattered potsherd or worn out man fell. Lost implement, implement probably just is like a fancy word for tool. So the lost tool, or shattered means broken, potsherd, or worn out man. Now, worn out is a phrasal verb which means very tired. So where the worn out man fell, where the very tired man fell, the very exhausted, maybe he was marching or walking and hasn't eaten in many days, and then he just falls because he's so tired and dies. There have they lain. So they stay there. They don't move. For all that anyone cared then, or knows now, it is the carelessness, in the literal sense, of the river as to the gravel which it carried, and an equal carelessness of those men as to what happened to their leavings that justify such a hypothesis of the credibility of these data, and make prehistoric times at least a penumbra of history. Oh wow. I haven't read this before, so I had no idea how complicated this was, but I think even for a native speaker, this requires some very careful translation. Okay. It is the carelessness, in the literal sense, of the river as to the gravel which it carried. So, I think by carelessness, they mean like chance. It's the chance. It's the luck. As to the gravel is like little stones. So it's just by chance that the river carries the little stones to this place or that place. An equal carelessness of those men as to what happened to their leavings. So an equal chance of what people left behind that justify such a hypothesis of the credibility of these data and make prehistoric times at least a penumbra of history. Let's look up that word, penumbra. Very fancy words here. But it's Cambridge, so I guess, and it's 100 years ago, 120 years ago. Let's see, penumbra. Partially shaded outer region of the shadow cast by an opaque object. Oh, wow. I'm not even sure what that means. Let's see. Okay. Actually, I'm just going to get a picture of it. So here's a penumbra. So it's like the outside, the soft shadow part of a shadow. Okay. So how do they use that here? Let me center this better. The credibility and makes prehistoric times at least a penumbra of history. So I think what they're saying is that there's a lot more speculation than there are facts about prehistory. like the very ancient. I think when they say prehistory, I think they mean before writing. Actually, let's get the official definition of prehistory. I shouldn't be making up my own definitions like that because I don't know what I'm talking about. Let's see. Prehistoric meaning. Yeah, before written records. That's what prehistory means, before writing. So they're saying that prehistory, before writing, is the penumbra of history, which means uh, it's not so clear, it's not so defined, just like the outside of a shadow, the softer part of a shadow. It's more guessing or speculation than it is factual. Okay. Now, nor are we compelled any longer by the prejudice or authority to regard those times as catastrophically short, any more than we must believe that Rome was built in a day. So let's see, nor are we compelled any longer by prejudice or authority to regard those times as catastrophically short. So maybe there was a perception 130 years ago that the prehistory era was very short. So, nor are we compelled, nor are we forced any longer by prejudice. So, I guess there used to be a prejudice, a preconception, an idea to think of the prehistory as a very short period of time. That seems to be what they're saying, in my opinion. Any more than we must believe that Rome was built in a day. That's a very common saying. Rome wasn't built in a day. That's what you tell people when they're being impatient. It takes forever to learn Spanish. Well, be patient. Rome wasn't built in a day. It's a pretty common saying, or at least it used to be. Let's see. Man's prehistory merges in the pageant of the animal world. Pageant is like a show, like a parade, or something like that. So they're just using fancy language here. Man's prehistory merges in the pageant. So there are many different kinds of animals walking around, and man is one of them in the pageant of the animal world. And of the planet-wide arena on which it has been in progress. Mountain and sea basin, too, have their history. Their geographical distribution has varied in immemorial years. So they're saying even land, mountains and water, bodies of water, have a history, and they change over time. The faith that can remove mountains is the same kind as that which the historian brings together armies and frontiers, bone to his bone, showing all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time. Oh, let's see. Their geographical distribution has varied in immemorial years. The faith that can remove mountains is the same in kind as that in which the historian brings together armies and frontiers. Bone to his bone. That's actually very confusing. Bone to his bone? What does that mean? Bone to his bone. I'm not sure what they mean by this expression. Let's see, to his bones, thoroughly. Well, there's an expression, to his bones, which means thoroughly. Thoroughly means completely, like 100%. Let's see if that works. Well, sometimes they use, this book is like 120 years old, so sometimes they use expressions that people don't really use anymore. Uh, let's see. The faith that can remove mountains is the same kind as that in which the historian brings together armies and frontiers. Now I lost my place. Bone to his bone, showing all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time. Okay, now this is really complicated, but what they're saying here is that just like the rivers and mountains have changed over time, there's a similar force at work which creates frontiers, borders, countries, and what was the other word? Armies. I'm not sure about this bone to his bone expression, showing all the kingdoms in the world in a moment of time. Such historical geography and historical ethnology are a proper prelude to the history of the ancient world. So, historical geography, remember, geography is about land, how the land looks, how the land is shaped. So, historical geography would be studying how the land has changed over history, how the waters have changed, how the mountains or land has changed. And ethnology, ethnic, is a word used to describe groups of people who share similar cultures or languages. That's an ethnicity. So ethnology is the study of groups of people who share very similar cultures, maybe other things too, are a proper prelude to the history of the ancient world. So they're saying it's really important, or a good way to, if you want to study history, to start with studying how the land has changed over time, and also studying how groups of people have behaved in prehistory before talking about the ancient world. And much even within that history cannot fully be understood without them. So they're actually saying, you have to do this, you have to start here by studying how geography has changed over time, and also how early groups of people interacted before you can study the ancient world, if you really want to understand the ancient world. Ancient peoples come upon the stage of history not all together, but in a certain order, and by their proper entrances, each with a character and makeup congruous with the part they will play. Okay, so they're saying ancient civilizations didn't just appear; they happened in a particular order for a particular reason. Let's see. There's some words here that we should look at. Ancient peoples come upon the stage of history, not all together, but in a certain order, and by their proper entrances, each with a character, each with a special, when they say each with a character, each with a special, unique way of doing things, and makeup. Makeup means, maybe we could say customs. So each with a very unique way of approaching the world and unique customs, congruous with the part they will play. Congruous. Let's look up that word to get a proper definition on it. Congruous. In agreement, in harmony. So let's see. Congruous with the part they will play. So each culture appears, or each civilization, or each group of people appear for many different reasons, but there's always a special purpose that fits exactly what the period needs. The pageant, remember, pageant is like parade, or is it the drama? So is it like a play, a show of history? Presupposes the formation of that character and its equipment in the green room of the remoter past, and the sketch of the growth of initial cultures which follows now is intended like the hypothesis of a Greek play. Oh gosh, okay. I'm pretty sure that this book is like the end of the 19th century or the very beginning of the 20th century. So I'm kind of fascinated that they use this term green room. The pageant, or is it the drama, of history presupposes the formation of that character and its equipment. So this interaction of people is something that you can't really study unless you're very aware of the uniqueness of these different groups of people. And if you don't consider that, if you don't consider the uniqueness of these different groups of people, then it would be, you won't get a very good understanding. I think that's what they're saying. This is very complicated, actually. Now, they're saying the green room, and I just know green room from TV shows, or, yeah, mostly TV shows. When there's a TV show where, you know, maybe you're interviewing someone or you have guests, the guests wait in a special room, which for some reason is called the green room. So when it's their turn to come out, they say, okay, now John Smith is coming out. He leaves the green room and then goes on to the show. So I'm kind of shocked that they're using it here. I wonder how old that term is. Maybe this book isn't. I have to check the date on the publishing date on this book, but I'm surprised that they're using this term green room. So here, the way they're using it, because they are comparing the study of history to a show or a drama. And so, let's see, the pageant, or is it a drama, of history presupposes the formation of that character. So you have to understand how these cultures or these groups of people came together and why. And its equipment in the green room of the remoter past. So the remoter past, the far past, is the place before the show, you know, because this series of books is about ancient civilization, and before talking about ancient civilization, they're talking about prehistory, so that we can understand the ancient civilization better later. So the prehistory is the green room, where they're sitting and waiting to be called up for the show. Okay, let's see. And the sketch of the growth of the initial cultures, which follows now, is intended, like the hypothesis of a Greek play, to describe how men came by those qualities of build and temperament, those aims in life, and the means wherewith they were attempting to achieve them. For the student of prehistory, a culture is nothing more or less than this: the total equipment with which each generation of men starts on its career. It is literally that equipment which the men of each generation were discarding when they and it respectively ceased to be of significant use. So I guess at this time the focus is on because they keep using this word equipment. They've used it several times. And I've kind of in my head been thinking they mean tools, the kind of tools that people use. Maybe it's more than that when they say equipment, what they mean. But they're saying this is really the definition of culture, at least to archaeologists. Let's read that again. The total, let's see. To the student of prehistory, so we're talking about prehistory, a culture is nothing more or less than this: the total equipment with which the generation of men starts on its career. So, because prehistory means before writing, before records, and so the only thing that you can know about these people are the tools or the things that they left in the ground, and that's all you can know about them. It's literally that equipment which the men of each generation were discarding, which means throw away, when they and it respectively ceased to be of significant use. So when they didn't need something anymore, they just tossed it. And that's all we know about them, whatever they threw away. We just know them from their garbage. To see how the stage itself was set for this pageant, we must look back beyond the moment when the first characters enter it. For it has been nature, rather than man, hitherto, in almost every scene, that has determined where the action shall lie. Oh boy. Okay, let's see. To see how the stage itself was set for this pageant. Okay, so the pageant, I think, is the ancient history that eventually we'll be getting to. We must look back beyond that moment. So we have to look back before ancient history, when the first characters enter it. So we have to, I guess they want to find the point where they can actually see the transformation from prehistory to history. And that's entering into the pageant, entering into the show. In almost every scene that has determined where the action shall lie. Only at a comparatively late phase of that action does man, in some measure, shift the scenery for himself. Okay, well, let's read that again. In almost every scene that has determined where the action shall lie. Only at a comparatively late phase of that action does man, in some measure, shift the scenery for himself. So I guess what they're saying, and I'm not sure, but it sounds like what they're saying is that the moment prehistory becomes history is significant because it's sort of like humans taking more control of their story. I think. I'm not sure. It's a little bit complicated. Okay, let's see. And by nature and man are here meant neither supernatural force nor superhuman design, altering the arrangement of us and our surroundings like chessmen on a board. Oh gosh, okay. I didn't think it was going to be this complicated. This is funny. It's really funny. Okay, let's see. And by nature and man are here meant neither supernatural force nor superhuman design, altering the arrangement of us and our surroundings like chessmen on a board. Nature adopted our speech from Latin natura, an unlucky mistranslation of I don't know what that is. That's Greek. Stands as a common and inclusive term for all physical events that happen. Okay. And by nature and man are here meant neither supernatural force nor superhuman design. So I think what they mean by supernatural or superhuman is they're not getting into any discussions about God altering an arrangement of us and our surroundings like chessmen on a board. So maybe in the past, especially since this book was written 100 years ago or more, there was maybe a temptation to, especially if you're talking about prehistory, to also talk about God. And they're saying we're not going to look at this in a way of like gods playing a game of chess. Nature adopted our speech from Latin natura, an unlucky mistranslation of the Greek. So I don't know what that word is, but the word nature, they're saying, was a loan word from Greek into Latin, but it was a bad translation of what the Greek language meant. Stands as a common and inclusive term for all physical events that happen. Its Greek original being a verbal substantive signifying the fact of growth. Okay, so the way we use the word nature, it just means all, let's see, how do they define it again? Inclusive term for, so, and this is true, I think, in English, for all physical events that happen. So nature, let's see how Google translates nature. Or translates, defines. Let's see. Nature definition. Phenomena of physical world collectively, including plants, animals, the landscape, and other features and products of the earth, as opposed to humans or human creations. Okay. That's pretty close to, I think, to what how they're defining nature here also. But they're saying the Greek original, so even in Latin, which borrowed the word from Greek, it's a loan word from Greek. The word nature just means physical things around us, not created by man. But in the original Greek, according to this, it signifies or means something, things that grow, or the way things grow. The mere process of a world as apprehended by a mind. The mere processes of a world as apprehended by a mind. So I think what they're saying is that in the original Greek, the word nature is more about a process than physical things not created by man. It's a process of growth or movement. Nor with any question, what shall it be in the end thereof? So, without trying to predict the outcome of what something should be, I guess is what they're saying there. It's a little bit complicated, the wording. Okay. These are matters outside natural history and human history alike. All history is the mere study of processes, of the way things grow in the old Greek sense. For to this, modern thought has laboriously but unequivocally reverted after long preoccupation with beginnings and endings, with cosmogony and eschatology of all kinds in the centuries between Greek science and our own. So, according to this book, history is about processes, or the way things grow in the old Greek sense. For to this, modern thought has laboriously but unequivocally reverted. But now they're saying here, and again, this is like 100 years ago, that for a long time, the study of history was about how things started or how things finished. But starting around now, meaning 100 years ago, they started to change this and to study more about the process rather than the beginning or the end, talking more about the process. Okay, now they've got some funky words here. Let's see, cosmogony. Let's look that up. Cosmogony. Cosmogony is a branch of science that deals with the origin of the universe, especially the solar system. And eschatology. What is eschatology? A part of theology concerned with death, judgment, and the final destiny of the soul in humankind. Okay, so let's read that again. All history is the mere study of processes, of the way things grow, in the old Greek sense. For to this, modern thought has laboriously but unequivocally reverted after a long preoccupation with the beginnings and endings. So they're saying the study of history has changed. It used to focus on beginnings and endings, but now they're focusing on the whole process. With cosmogony, the thinking about the origins of the universe, and eschatology of all kinds in the centuries between science and our own. So I think what they're saying is that previously, before this period where they're starting to focus on the process, people studying history were focused on beginnings and endings. But this surprises me. But also, well, at least the cosmogony part, that they were also very focused on the origins of the universe and eschatology. So the eschatology part, focusing on spiritual things or religious things, that doesn't surprise me. But now they're not doing that so much. I think that's what they're saying. It's a little bit confusing, the way it's written. Okay. Within this nature, so presented as a process or coherent sequence of occurrences, and so far as we know, by inference of me and you, each from experience of the rest of us, corporeally participant in what goes on. Okay. Wait, let's finish the sentence. As part of this nature stands man, perceiving what goes on, learning what that is, conceiving it as alterable by inventive effort, and striving accordingly with the experience of what we call results, great or small, of that strife. Okay. Oh, wow. That is a very complicated paragraph. Okay, so within this nature, so within this process, so presented as a process or coherent sequence of occurrences, and so far as we know, a part of this nature stands man, perceiving what goes on. Okay, so they're saying that people, humans, are a witness to this process, are kind of uniquely a witness to this process. Now let's read the parentheses. By inference of me and you, each from experience of the rest of us corporally. Okay, that means like physically. That's another way I think of saying physically, from our bodies. Participant in what goes on. So we're participants, we participate in it, but we also witness it. We also see this process. Learning what that is, conceiving it as alterable by inventive effort. So also we can participate in it. We can change it. We can change the course of events. We can change the process, and striving accordingly, and we do. Striving means like trying to do it or fighting to do it. So we actively try to change the process with experience of what we call results, great or small, of that strife. Strife is like a fight or a battle. So what they're saying in that very complicated paragraph is that we are witnesses and participants of history. By man, then, in what follows, is meant the collective total of such perceiving, learning, inventing, striving, and experiencing selves, myself and yours and theirs. By men, then, in what follows, is meant the collective total. So, by man, then, in what follows, is meant, so that they're saying that what follows, the information that they'll be talking about in the book, is what humans have perceived, what they have learned, what they have invented, what they have strived for. Striving means like trying, but let's get a good definition. I don't like my definition. I'm sure we can find a better one here. Strive. Let's see. To strive. Make great efforts to achieve or obtain something. So striving is making a big effort to do something. So they're saying this book, or this series of books, is going to be all about how humans interpret the world, what they have learned, what they have invented, what they have tried to do or made a great effort to do, what they have experienced. Well, it says experiencing selves, myself and yours and theirs. So how being human, I guess. By races of men are meant groups and sequences of such selves linked by corporeal similarities. So corp means body. So corporeal similarities, physical, bodily similarities. So they're defining race here. They're saying, by races of men are meant groups and sequences of such selves, of such people, linked by corporeal similarities, physical similarities, propagated by natural process within each group, by peoples. Well, let's get a definition for propagate. Propagate. Breed, natural process, spread, promote. So I think we can use the word spread or promote, going out to other people. Let's see, where was that? By races of men are meant groups and sequences of such selves linked by corporeal similarities, bodily, physical similarities, propagated by natural processes, spread out by natural processes within each group, or reproduced by peoples or nations, groups of selves, exhibiting peculiarities of interpretation. So each group has unique interpretations of the world. Each group has unique inventions of the world and effort sufficiently similar for the results to be cumulative and coherent. And by cultures or civilizations, the accumulated and coherent results of such similarities in the activity of selves, like you and me. So they're defining a couple of things here. They're defining race, which means corporeal similarities, bodily similarities, physical similarities. Peoples or nations are groups of selves or maybe races exhibiting very unique, special interpretations of the world and inventions and goals that are very similar. And cultures or civilizations are accumulated or coherent results. So their definition of culture or civilization is like the history or the evolution of all of these efforts and inventions and interpretations of the world. Okay, so now let's move on to part 2, pre-glacial geography. So a glacier is a big piece of ice, like a big mountain of ice. So pre-glacial geography, they're going to talk about, because I'm just remembering this from, I don't know, many years ago in school, when they talk about how the Earth changed. There was a point where there were many glaciers, many mountains of ice all over the Earth, and it's speculated that at some point they melted and then the glaciers moved and sort of carved the Earth and changed the geography. So pre-glacial geography is, they're talking about the Earth before this change. Let's see. The stage of human history is a wide one from the first, even disregarding those varieties of man in Inner Asia or Equatorial Africa which come latest and most incidentally into the story. The stage even of ancient history is the whole home of the white races. From the Atlantic coast of Europe to the Persian Plateau, from the Sahara to the Baltic, the northwestern quadrant of the land mass of the Old World. Oh, let's take a look at that again. The stage of human history is a wide one from the first, even disregarding those varieties of man in Inner Asia or Equatorial Africa, which come latest and most incidentally into the story. So I think that what they're saying here is that Europeans or Westerners didn't really know much about Africans or people in, I'm not sure what they mean by Inner Asia. Maybe that means Central Asia. Couldn't mean Central Asia. Maybe, I'm not sure what, let's see. If I Google Inner Asia, I think that's probably like an old-fashioned term. Inner Asia. I've never heard that term before, but I've got a map here. Let's see. But there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of recorded history about this part of the world. So I wonder why they're disregarding it. Because they say disregarding Equatorial Africa and Inner Asia, but I mean, because I don't think that Equatorial Africa has much recorded history, but definitely this part of the world definitely does. So I wonder, okay, well, I don't know why, but let's keep reading. That's, according to Google, that's Inner Asia. All right, let's see. So the stage of human history is wide from the first. Even if you don't think about varieties of man in Inner Asia or Equatorial Africa, which come latest and most incidentally into the story, the stage even of ancient history is the whole home of the white races. So they're focusing on Whitey. Let's see. From the Atlantic coast of Europe to the Persian Plateau, from the Sahara to the Baltic, the northwestern quadrant of the landmass of the Old World. To understand even the actual configuration of this area, some of which is very complicated, still more to understand the changes which have occurred in the form and extent of the land masses since they have been inhabited by man, we must review the whole series of events which have resulted in the formation of the present European peninsula, of the sea basins which lie north and south of it, and also of its eastward continuation into Hither Asia. Hither is kind of like, you don't really use that word anymore. It's kind of an archaic word, but it kind of means like to here. So, but I think what they mean by Hither Asia is like the parts of Asia that are not very well mapped or known. Let's take a look at that word hither. Hither, toward this place, situated on this side. So I think they just mean like far Asia or lesser known Asia or not very well known Asia. A similar constituted highland with comparatively low-lying flatlands to the north and south. For if we trace this series of events far enough back, we reach, at all events, the more immediate reasons for those strongly marked contrasts in the composition and structure of its rocks, which have so profoundly affected the habitability and human prosperity of each component region, through the peculiar distribution of its plants and animals, and eventually its breed of man. So they're saying we have to look at the geography of this area from all the way from Europe all the way into Asia, and consider the landscape. Consider what kind of things grow there. Are there mountains? Is it flat? In order to understand what kind of people eventually lived there and how they lived there. Herodotus, attempting to summarize the contrast between the northern flatland and the Aegean cradle of the Greeks, describes Scythia as a land where there are no earthquakes and they grow corn for sale. That immensity of arable is itself the corollary of the flatland's long immunity from geographical stress. Okay, let's look at that again. Herodotus, attempting to summarize the contrast between the northern flatland and the Aegean cradle of the Greeks, describes Scythia as a land where there are no earthquakes and they grow corn for sale. That immensity of arable, so immensity means really big, and arable means that you can grow things there. But let's just check the official definition. Yeah, it says used for, or suitable for growing crops. So it's good farmland is what arable land is. Okay, let's check the word corollary. I think that means connected, like it comes from correlation, but I just want to be sure. A proposition that follows from and is often appended to one already proved, forming a proposition. All right, let's see. That immensity of arable is itself the corollary of the flatland. So the flatland's long immunity from geological stress. So what they're saying is that that's a really big piece of land they're talking about that is very good for farming. And the fact that there are no earthquakes there and that it's flat is it's very logical that, or is a corollary of the flatland's long immunity. That immensity, it's weird that they're using arable as a noun here, and I almost wonder if it's a misprint, like they should be saying arable land, but I don't know. So that immensity of arable land is itself the corollary of the flatland's long immunity from geological stress. I think we can just say that it's a big piece of land. It's a very large area of land, very good for farming, and it doesn't have any geological stress. There are no earthquakes or no bad things happening there. So it was very easy for people to survive there and farm. And its accumulation of successive sediments as seafloor or dusty desert. Sediment is, well, let's get, I know what it is. I can't define it though. So let's get a real definition here. Sediment. Things that settle to the bottom of liquid. So if there's water and things fall into the water, they go down to the bottom, and that's sediment. Its accumulation of successive sediments as seafloor or dusty desert, the recurring earthquakes in Greece and Italy through ancient and modern times are sufficient evidence that the process of mountain building is not yet complete, and the rarity and discontinuity of cultivable. I've never seen that word. It comes from the word cultivate, which means that you can create crops, you can create plants, but I've never seen cultivable soils, illustrates the dislocation and wear and tear incidental to such process. Oh gosh, the way they write is so complicated. So they're comparing this place Scythia, which I'm not really sure where that's supposed to be, which was ideal for growing crops because of the lack of earthquakes and the good soil. And they're comparing it to Italy and Greece, which have earthquakes and maybe not so. Well, they're saying that the earthquakes are evidence that the process of mountain building, there's still mountains being created, and the rarity and discontinuity, and the soil isn't so good for growing things. Okay, the catastrophic geology of Genesis and the Psalms voices the same experience of nature's workings among a people of the Nearer East. Let us summarize then that the main course of that period of planetary history, within which the history of man is one of the most recent episodes. The main course of that period of planetary history, within which the catastrophic geology of Genesis and the Psalms voices the same experience of nature's working among the people of the Near East. So, Genesis and the Psalms are books in the Bible, and they're using that as evidence, saying that you can read about all kinds of crazy things, crazy natural disasters in those books, and they're using that as evidence that people have been dealing with these kinds of problems forever. And their point is that if you're talking about human history, it's just a very short episode of a much larger planetary history. Okay. The chalk which composes the white walls of England and the massive limestones of the hills which stand about Jerusalem and the similar grey limestone which gives its wilder grace to the landscape of Greece were formed by deposition on the floor of a great sea which covered all, and more than all, of the stage on which history has played its greatest drama hitherto. So they're saying the things that we see now were all part of a giant ocean or sea. So the natural things that we see now, such as the chalk walls of England and the massive limestones of the hills of Jerusalem, and the grey limestone, which gives its wilder grace to the landscape of Greece, they were all formed by the deposit, leaving on the floor of a great sea. So these were all once part of a giant ocean, according to this book, which covered all, and more than all, of the stage on which history has played its greatest drama hitherto. So it just, I think what they're saying in the past is all of this was a giant ocean before. This sea, to which geologists give the picturesque name of Tethys, I've never seen that before, belongs to the second of three great schemes of oceans and continents, whose distribution can be distinguished in the long course of the Earth's history. So this giant hypothetical sea is called Tethys. I wonder if that's still, let's see, if I Google Tethys. I just don't know if that's still a thing. I've never heard of that before. Not that I know anything about history. Tethys Sea. Let's try that. Ancient Greek mythology. What is the meaning of the Tethys Sea? A sea that lay between Laurasia and Gondwanaland, the two supercontinents formed by the first split of the larger supercontinent Pangaea. The Tethys Sea can be regarded as the predecessor of today's smaller Mediterranean Sea. So it's still something. It's still a thing. I mean, when you're reading a history book from 120 years ago, things change or ideas change. But that's still a thing, I guess. Okay. It had taken shape as the result of that period of violent planetary convulsion. So convulsion is like a big movement. So like an earthquake, maybe. Which closed the primary phase and its obliteration, with the exception of the Mediterranean, Pontic, Caspian, and Caribbean basins, marks the change from the secondary to the tertiary in which human history is the most recent episode. So, oh gosh, we have to go back. It had taken shape as a result of that period of violent planetary convulsion, which closed the primary phase. So this giant sea happened because of some big movement of the planet, maybe a giant earthquake or something. And it says which closed the primary phase, which closed the first period of the earth, and its obliteration and its ruin, or its disappearing, with the exception of the Mediterranean, Pontic, and Caribbean basins. So, like maybe, so its obliteration means like it's disappearing, with the exception of the Mediterranean. So, what is left of that sea is the Mediterranean, the Pontic, Caspian, and the Caribbean basins. And it marks the change from the secondary to the tertiary, so from the second to the third stage, in which human history is the most recent episode. Unlike the modern Atlantic and Pacific Oceans of the tertiary phase, which, whatever their breadth, extend from the Arctic to the Antarctic Circle. Unlike the, I'm going to read that again. Unlike the modern Atlantic and Pacific Oceans of the tertiary phase, which, whatever, when they say whatever their breadth, it means like whatever, however big they are. They extend from the Arctic to the Antarctic Circle. Tethys had its greatest diameter from east to west, and was comparatively narrow from north to south. Eastward, it abutted on an ancient Angara continent. So these are all things, I guess, that don't exist anymore. So there's this continent, Angara, of which the solid core lay in northeastern Asia, northeastern Asia, like so China, Korea, maybe Siberia, with more recent extensions further south. Westward, it opened into a Pacific Ocean. Southward, it was bounded by another ancient continent, Gondwana land. I've never heard of these places before. Which had once extended in one vast oblong from the west of South America to the east of Australia. Wow, so the world's completely changed according to this. But was already foundering in places. Oh, let's take a look at that word, foundering, which I guess means like becoming unstable or disappearing. Let's see, foundering. Filled with water and sink, fall or break down, typically as a result of a particular problem. Yeah, so breaking apart or disappearing, falling apart, breaking. So let's see, what was foundering again? Where did it go? So it had once extended in one vast oblong, one big like rectangle, from the west of South America to the east of Australia. But it was already foundering in places. It was already breaking apart. It was already disappearing. So that growing gulfs in its southern margin were separating South America from South Africa, and South Africa from Australia. First symptoms of the South Atlantic and Indian Oceans that were to be. Similar collapse of its northern margin allowed the waters of Tethys to form a deep bay between Brazil and Morocco. And a long gulf between East Africa on the one hand, and on the other, a Lemurian peninsula connecting South Africa through Madagascar with peninsular India. Both of these eventually broke clean through to meet the southern Gulfs and insulated South America and Lemuria forever. Round the north end of Lemuria, there was in due course open sea between Tethys and the new Indian Ocean, and meanwhile the rise of the first mountain structure of southeastern Asia connected the Australian fragment of old Gondwana with the southward appendages of Angara land, so that a single continent extended from the Arctic, Siberia to New Zealand. Okay, well, it's just confused. I can't really put that in simpler terms because they're just describing geography. Let's see if we can find a picture of what they're talking about. So what should we call this? What if we just say Tethys? Oh. Just so we can maybe see a picture of it, that might help. Let's see if we can find a picture of what they're trying to describe here. Yeah, okay, let's look at this. So this is what they're describing. This is, I guess, the thing they're trying to explain to us. So here is Gondwana land, and Siberia is up here. Okay. Well, that's better than me trying to explain that because it's awfully confusing. They're using a lot of directions and details. There's no way to really talk about that in any clear way. Okay. I think we stopped here. Northward, Tethys had probably sea passage of uncertain and perhaps varying width to an Arctic Ocean between Angara land and Scandinavia. One of the oldest and most massive cornerstones of the whole fabric. West of this again, between Scandinavia and Britain, a narrower strait extended far north and perhaps reached the same Arctic Ocean. Beyond this, the rugged Caledonian highlands of Britain stood outpost on the eastern margin of the Laurentian continent. The south coast of Laurentia probably crossed the Atlantic Ocean along the modern liner route. So along when they say liner route, that means like the steamships like the Titanic. That's the liner route. So as if we know what that is now, but the routes the ships take. Bulging then southward round the nascent Appalachian chain. Nascent means like being born or new or baby. So the nascent, well, we better check the official definition. Nascent, just coming into existence, beginning to display signs of future potential. So the Appalachian chain is in the eastern United States, and nascent means it's just coming up. It's just being born. So bulging southward around the nascent Appalachian chain, and then retreating northward near the Pacific coast of North America till it approached or even joined eastern Angara land beyond the North Pacific. All north of this coastline seems to have been solid land with Greenland and Labrador at its core. But from time to time, a wide lakeland covered the middle west of North America. Round these ancient shores, under the influence of solar heat, the general planetary circulation of wind and sea currents played then as now. So the sea currents and the wind patterns appear to well, have the same kind of influence they do now. The resulting climates, however, were very different by reason of the shape of the sea basins and the altitudes of the land masses, in particular the long through of Tethys, lying wholly in north temperate and subtropical latitudes, and landlocked towards the north from Mexico to Scandinavia, served like the Mediterranean of today, but on a vaster scale. Let's read that again. Tethys, lying wholly in north temperate and subtropical latitudes, and landlocked towards the north of Mexico to Scandinavia, served like the Mediterranean of today. So maybe I guess what they're saying is, imagine it's like this sea Tethys. Imagine it's kind of like the Mediterranean, only much larger, going all the way from Mexico to Scandinavia. I think that's what they're saying. That's how I interpret it. Maybe I'm wrong. But on a vaster scale, on a bigger scale. So they're saying it's like the Mediterranean, but much, much bigger. To mitigate and assimilate in an exceptional degree the climates of its foreshores, and still more those of its islands. Oh, what maybe they're saying is that, the Mediterranean influences the climate in North Africa and Europe, and the Tethys Sea did the same thing, but on a much bigger scale, from Mexico to Scandinavia. It influenced the climate. For through most of Tethys was open water. A large region between North Africa and Scandinavia was broken by large islands, ruinous fragments of continents, older still, like Scandinavia itself, and the Caledonian Highlands, Snowdonia, and the Malvern and Mendip Hills, embedded in the margin of Laurentia. Okay. Well, they're giving a really detailed verbal description of this ancient world. One such form now, the plateau core of Spain and Portugal, Sardinia, Corsica, Elba, and the rugged toe of Italy are peaks of another, which we may call Tyrrhenia. The Caucasus, the Bohemian Highland, the Ardennes, and others round whose skirts old shingle banks and other shore deposits replace the clean limestones characteristic of greater depths. So early in the history of the planet was the site of our European and Mediterranean region, conspicuous for its abnormalities and its juxtaposition of old and new. Okay. So early in the history of the planet was the site of our European and Mediterranean region, conspicuous. So what they're saying is very early on in this prehistory, this is when the strange, unique landscape of Europe and the Mediterranean was formed. And its juxtaposition, you could use juxtaposition to mean you place two things next to each other and you compare them. And you can see, it's really easy to see how different things are when you put them next to each other. You can see the differences very easily. That's what juxtaposition is about. And the things they're comparing is the old and the new. I'm a little bit confused about what they're comparing, because they're saying that this sea was the thing that, well, wait a minute. I think we have to go back for a minute. Okay. For though the most of Tethys was open water, a large region between North Africa and Scandinavia was broken by large islands, ruinous fragments of continents older still, like Scandinavia itself, and the Caledonian Highlands, Snowdonia, and the Malvern and Mendip Hills embedded in the margin of Laurentia. So Tethys was mostly just water, but there were a couple of very large islands, which were the remains of even older continents. And then they named the continents. And let's see, one such forms now the plateau core of Spain and Portugal. So they're saying that these islands that used to be in the sea are now like the central parts of Spain and Portugal, Sardinia, Corsica, and the rugged toe of Italy. So uh, in the past, when this sea existed, I guess those were islands that were part of even more ancient continents. I think that's what they're saying. This is pretty complicated. Okay, let's see. The Caucasus, the Bohemian Highlands, the Ardennes, are others, round whose skirts old shingle banks. What's a shingle bank? I have no idea. Shingle bank. Okay, it's like a rocky beach, I guess. Let's take a look. I've got a picture here. I'm just Googling shingle bank. And I see a lot of things like this. Like a stony, rocky beach. Okay. So old shingle banks and other shore deposits. Okay, so deposit means like what the water left. Replace the clean limestones characteristic of the greater depths. So early history of the planet was the site. So early in the history of the planet was the site of our European and Mediterranean region, conspicuous for its abnormalities and its juxtaposition of old and new. So I think the juxtaposition here is maybe thinking about things like the shingle banks, which are evidence of the ocean that existed before, and comparing that side by side with these limestone mountains or limestone structures that you can see in certain parts of Europe. That's what I think they're saying, but this is awfully complicated. Okay, let's see. The tertiary period of crust history, which is still in progress, for the term quaternary, signifying those recent phases when man's presence can be demonstrated, is a needless concession to self-esteem. Is characterized, like its primary and secondary predecessors, by vast means big, by vast, where did we go? Well, let's start over. I don't understand the self-esteem reference. The tertiary period of crust history, which is still in progress, for the term quaternary, signifying those recent phases when man's presence can be demonstrated, is a needless concession to self-esteem. Why are they saying that? Is characterized, like its primary and secondary predecessors, by a vast readjustment of the crust, breaking up the Laurentian and Indo-African continents and crumpling the Cretaceous seabed of Tethys into a series of elevated ridges. These folds result from two series of lateral stresses, the one thrusting outward from Angara land to east and west has caused a series of southward bulging arcs. Like the rucks in a tablecloth when a heavy book is pushed across it. Oh boy. Okay. So the tertiary period of crust history, let's see. Tertiary crust. Let's find a picture of that. Well, what they mean by crust. Let's find a picture of crust first. You know, the Earth has different sections. So the crust is this outer part. And so I guess there may be levels to this. So let's see if we can find a picture of the tertiary crust. Let's see. Oh, I don't know. How about this one? Well, I guess you get the idea just by looking at this, that the ground has layers, or you know, so we know what the crust is because we saw a picture of the Earth's crust. Or maybe, what is this one here? Whoops. Okay, so the crust is the yellow part here. And so I guess the tertiary crust is one of the levels here, I guess. All right, let's go back. Let's see if we can make sense of this. This is really hard. Okay. I feel so stupid. The tertiary period of crust history, which is still in progress. So I think what they're saying is we're still in that. We're still in the tertiary period. So the crust history, the tertiary crust must be the top level. For the term quaternary, signifying those recent phases when man's presence can be demonstrated, is a needless concession to self-esteem. Okay, I think I understand what they're saying now, which is the tertiary crust maybe is what we're on right now, or what we're still building it. It's still happening. And the term quaternary, actually, let's define that. I'll just look for quaternary period. Quaternary period of Earth crust. Let's see what that means. The quaternary period is the third tertiary and last of the three periods of Cenozoic era. You and I are living in this period, which began only 2.5 million years ago. This is less than 0.1% of all geologic time. A thin layer of sediments deposited during the quaternary covers much of the Earth's land surface. Okay. So they're saying this term quaternary, they're saying that it's a self-esteem issue, meaning it's a very long period, 2.5 million years, even relative to the history of the Earth. I guess it isn't. It's a very small period. But to humans, it's a very large period, 2.5 million years. So we give it a name, but in terms of Earth history or geological history, it's a very short period. So it's kind of a vain thing, a self-esteem thing, that we call it this, because it's so insignificant compared to the rest of the Earth's physical history. Okay, well, so this quaternary period is characterized like its primary and secondary. So you have first, second, third, primary, secondary, tertiary, third, predecessors by vast readjustments of the crust, vast changes of the crust. So each period has big changes, breaking up the Laurentian and Indo-African continents and crumpling the Cretaceous seabed of the Tethys into a series of elevated ridges. These folds result from two series of lateral stresses. Okay. So elevated ridges, a ridge is kind of like a cliff. Let's see. If I just type ridge, what do we get? What kind of pictures do we get with ridge? Okay, well actually, I guess there's it's a very precise geological term. So let's see, this is a ridge. Here's a picture of a ridge. These are ridges. It's kind of like, almost like a peak. It's like a long peak. Because a peak of a mountain is this, but a ridge is long. Okay, let's see. Okay, so Tethys into a sea of elevated ridges. And these folds result in two series of lateral stresses. So lateral stresses, lateral means going in a line, and stress means like pressure. So these ridges, I think this is what they're saying, put some kind of pressure on the earth. I don't know. Let's see. The one thrusting outwards from Angara land to east, south, and west has caused a series of southward bulging arcs, like the rucks in a tablecloth when a heavy book is pushed across it. Now, this word rucks, I've never used it in my life. I mean, I can imagine what it means, but let's see if we can know. I mean, if I Google rucks, I get some kind of football, soccer game. I don't know. Let's see. Okay, here's what I understood rucks to mean. I finally found a picture of it. This is what I was picturing as a ruck. So if you push a book across the tablecloth, you would create this kind of shape on the tablecloth. And I think that's what they mean by ruck here. All right, now I have to find my place. Okay. Well, let's read it again. The one thrusting, pushing outwards from Angara land to east, south, and west has caused a series of bulging arcs, like the rucks in a tablecloth when a heavy book is pushed across it, which define the present continent of Asia. So this change is what defines the shape of Asia now. Such arcs, arc is this shape, form the half-submerged island chains, Aleutian, Kurile, Japanese, Lu Chu, the grand sweep through Burma, and the Malay Peninsula with its insular prolongation to the Moluccas. the Himalayan range, and the Hindu Kush, the Iranian arc, which traverses Baluchistan, south and west Persia, and Kurdistan, and further west the Tauric and Dinaric systems, which bound respectively Asia Minor on the south and the Balkan Peninsula to the west, as far as the head of the Adriatic. Okay, we can't really go into detail about that, but the point is that these changes created the areas mentioned. Is all that in simple English, that's what they're saying. Then follows the southward and westward bulging Atlas range. Now I'm trying to ignore that word bulging, but I can't do it anymore. They just keep using it, so I think it's important that I guess I'm getting lazy because I've been reading this now for 2 hours. So I shouldn't ignore words like that. That's actually a common word that it's good to know what it means if you don't know it. So let me find a picture of something bulging. Bulging, I mean, really means pushing out. So, for example, let's take a look at this. So you see this stomach is bulging. It's pushing out. It's going out. That's a bulging stomach. The stomach next to it really isn't bulging. So I don't know if they're comparing bulging to non-bulging, or this is a before and after. But bulging means pushing out, sticking out. Usually you kind of imagine like a circle form, or a sphere, a circular form. Let's see if I can find another bulge somewhere. Okay, how about this? So I don't know what this is, but it's bulging out of the body, it looks like from the spine. And this is another picture. See, something is sticking out and it's kind of a circle. That's a bulge. Okay, let's go back. Okay, so then follows the southward and westward bulging Atlas range and its prolongation into southeastern Spain. Within these outer arcs rise other folds, obviously concentric with them, most easily recognizable in northeastern Asia. Let's see. I wonder what happens if I type northeastern Asia geography. Or let's say geology. Okay. Because then I think it's easier to imagine what they're talking about. It's very confusing, I mean, even for me. But I guess you can see the bulge pushing out at the bottom. Whoops, like this. Wait. That's the bulge pushing out that they're describing. And that's what it seems like to me, anyway. Whoops. Okay. So behind the Himalayas, but perceptible also in Iran and northern Asia Minor. Between the folds lie less crumpled areas. I guess we should look at this word crumpled. Crumpled is like this. So this is crumpled paper. So when they're describing the land, I mean, you can imagine on a map, if it looks crumpled, it looks like this. It's very uneven with a lot of ups and downs and cracks and things like that. So that's crumpled. Again, that's a word they keep using, crumpled. Okay, let's see here. I was hoping to finish this entire chapter, but I think I'm just going to read for like another hour. I'm getting tired. And then, yeah, I'll have to make another video to continue. It's going to be a long read. Okay, let's see. But then we'll know everything. We'll be history nerds. Okay. So, between the folds lie less crumpled areas at higher and lower levels. The plateau of Tibet stands now at over 15,000 feet, the Tarim Basin at over 3,000 feet, and the core of Asia Minor at about 1,000 feet above sea level. The Bering, Japan, China seas, and on the other hand, have a bottom of about 12,000 to 9,000 feet down, the Gulf of Oman at 6,000 feet, and the southern lobe of the Caspian at about 2,000 feet. Similarly, outside each greater arc, the margin of old Gondwana land has been forced down and under in the Bay of Bengal, in the Persian Gulf, where the whole of Arabia has been tilted like an ill-laid paving slab. Ill, you know, when you put that prefix ill in front of something, it means badly. So badly laid paving slab. Well, let's see what a paving slab is. I know what it is, but it's just better to find a picture. Here's a paving slab. So it's like, something like this. That's a paving slab. So they're saying that the Arabian Peninsula, because of these geological changes and because of this sea, it leaves Saudi Arabia. The Arabian Peninsula is like an ill-laid paving slab. Like it looks like a paving slab, like one of these, but not in such a even way. That's what the ill-laid part means. So where the whole of Arabia has been tilted, uneven, not straight, like an ill-laid paving slab. And in the eastern basin of the Mediterranean, where the North African foreland has been fractured stepwise, so that while the Libyan shore is beset with quicksands, the greatest depths are off the Peloponnese and Rhodes. So the Peloponnese, that's a group of islands in Greece, and Rhodes is an island in Greece. The folds of the other series result not from southward, but from northward thrusts. Thrust means push. And overhang similarly sunken forelands, this time on their northern side. Examples are the Altai range between Mongolia and western Siberia, the Caucasus, and the whole Alpine series, Balkans, Carpathians, Alps, and Pyrenees. The course of these Eastern European folds is complicated by several factors, chief among which is the presence of the older lands already mentioned, both north of the Alpine folds in Bohemia, the Black Forest, the Vosges, and the Auvergne, and within the folds area as in Spain, Tyrrhenia, and Hungary, the stubbornness of which has not merely accentuated the transverse amplitude and overfolding of the ridges themselves, but has compressed them lengthways into the S shape presented now by the Carpathians and caused a spiral distortion of the Pyrenees, Alps, Apennines, Atlas, and Spanish Balearic Arc. All right, so they're just talking about the way the sea has shaped these areas in the past. It's very complicated. It's confusing for me. Okay, finally, local relaxations of these strains brought about the collapse of whole regions of the crust. Oh, so these strains. So remember, they were talking about these ridges that were created, which put a lot of stress on the Earth, and then they're describing what kind of changes happened because of that stress of these enormous ridges. I think that's what I'm interpreting from all of this. Finally, local relaxations of these strains brought about the collapse of whole regions of the crust. So once everything got readjusted because of these ridges, it caused a lot of big changes in all of these parts of the world. Either parallel to the trend of the folded arcs or transversely. Transverse, let's just look up that word. It's kind of like maybe opposite or reverse. Let's see, transverse. Oh, it means situated or extending across something. So the changes happened either with the ridges or the folds, or they crossed the folds. Examples of longitudinal let's see, what is the difference between longitude and latitude? Difference. I always get those confused. Longitude and latitude. Latitudes are horizontal lines, and longitudes are vertical lines in the measure that measure east or west of the meridian. Oh, wait, let's find a picture. Okay. So latitude is east to west, and longitude is north to south. So examples of longitudinal, north to south, subsidence are the Black Sea and the southern Caspian, carrying away both ends of the Caucasus and another great segment of mountain range between the Crimea and the Balkans. Another is the Adriatic, nipped between the Dinaric Arc and the Apennines. Transverse fracture and collapse are illustrated within the mass of old Angara land by the long trough fault or rift valley of the Red Sea, which is prolonged between Crete and Rhodes, right across the junction of the Dinaric and Tauric arcs, submerging the Aegean archipelago and breaking down a shattered trough through Macedonia and Serbia to Hungarian plain. A branch of this same rift, forking west across the Dinaric folds, depressed the Gulf of Corinth. Another, diverging eastward further south, forms the Gulf of Aqaba, the Dead Sea, and the trough of Cole, Syria, and may be traced far athwart Armenia, athwart. We don't have to worry about a word like that. All these are only classical examples of the main types of crust movement to which the tertiary transformations of old tethys are due. Okay, I mean, it's just I'm not going to bother trying to explain all of that because it's just so technical. And I want to get to the history of people anyway. I'm so tired of already reading about the geological history, but I guess we have to go through it. But it's a little bit boring, to be honest. Okay, well, let's keep moving on though. Crust movements of such amplitude means like big, occupied a vast period of time. So these really major movements of the crust happened for very long periods of time. And all the while, rainfall and frost were denuding and dissecting the land surfaces. Rivers were transporting the debris and depositing it in lake basins and coastal seas. Limestones and marls were accumulated in deeper waters, and at times, along the lines of the severest distortion and fracture, volcanic matter was discharged from beneath. So I just want to find out, I don't know what a marl is, and I want to look that up. So a marl, I guess, is a type of rock. Here's a picture of a marl. That's a marl. Is that clay? Dried clay? It looks like dried clay. Now let me see. What is marl? Unconsolidated sedimentary rock or soil consisting of clay and lime. Okay, so it's just a type of, not exactly stone. Okay, so all these changes are happening, the water is moving, and it's carrying minerals and rocks into lakes, into the bottoms of lakes. And also volcanoes are exploding, and it's also blowing things into the land and into the lakes. Let's see. Principal stages in this tertiary derangement of what had been the Cretaceous sea bottom of Tethys may be summarized as follows. Their importance for us, over and above their contribution to the actual distribution of land and water, of mountains and plains, is that in conjunction with the changes of climate resulting from such a rearrangement of lands and seas, they have restricted or extended the regions which this or that type of vegetation could occupy, and the range of animal forms which such vegetation fed, and so contributed in due course to localize and differentiate the main varieties of man. So they're saying changes, the change in the sea and the change in the landscape, and where all these minerals were deposited is what later on determined or helped people of certain areas, helped them to decide which kind of food to grow, or which kind of animals lived there, or which kind of cultures or civilizations came up from it. Foldings and upheavals of the old seafloor began earliest as they have since reached their greatest amplitude eastward in the heart of Asia, where the Himalaya, Kuen-Lun, and Tian Shan ranges, with the plateau of Tibet and Mongolia uplifted between them, intervened between Angara land and the Lemurian subcontinent, of which only fragments soon remained, represented by Madagascar and peninsular India, El- Elsewhere, too, this stage there was widespread exposure of the sea floor, especially along the east and west axis of upheaval, which eventually becomes the highland zone of Western Asia and Europe. And without being elevated, many of the remaining sea basins dried up altogether, leaving vast deposits of salt and gypsum, like those which are forming now in the waste heart of Persia. All right. So, again, they're just describing all of the changes that happened during this period. Renewed submergence followed from the Western Ocean as far as the Kordofan and as far east as Khorasan, but the Hindu Kush and Iranian Arc barred off forever from Tethys its old southward gulf. And a mere bulging of the African continent cut off the El Juf depression in the Western Sahara from what we may now begin to call the Midland Sea. For it is the first phase of the Mediterranean of today. But the fauna and flora. Fauna is a Latin word for animals, and flora is a Latin word for plants. So whenever you're reading something about science, they don't say animals and plants. They always say fauna and flora. And fauna means animals, and flora means plants. But the fauna and flora, the plants and the animals of the lands which were appearing now along the line of the Alpine folds were still essentially of such Indo-African type as had spread thither to there during the period of exposure. And such they long remained. So the animals that you might find in the Alps of Europe were similar to, I guess, animals that you would find in Africa, African style animals at the time because of their connection. For these lands were mainly insular, and as the Laurentian continent still limited the Atlantic northwards, not far from the line joining Newfoundland to Cornwall, the oceanic currents which bathed their shores maintained a subtropical climate, warm, moist, and equable. Further folding and upheaval from the western arcs extended and consolidated the mountain zone of the Near East, as long promontory connected the high plateau of Asia with these mid-European islands, and these again with the British promontory of Laurentia. I've heard that word promontory before, but I'm not really sure what that means. Let's look it up. Promontory, a point of high land that juts out in a large body of water. Okay, let's find a picture of a promontory just so that we can see. So, let's see. So here's an example of a promontory. It juts out, it goes out, it sticks out. Here's another one. Let's see. So it's just land that sticks out into the water. Okay. The British promontory of Laurentia along a very ancient line of folding represented by the Ardennes and the Mendip. The result was to bisect the Midland Sea into a southern or Mediterranean and a northern or Sarmatian basin, which henceforth have separate histories until almost modern times. A further result was that a sinuous Apennine Atlas ridge encircled a West Mediterranean basin. I know that word sinuous, but I can't think of what it means right now. Sinuous. Having many curves or turns. That's not what I thought at all. A further result was that the sinuous Apennine Atlas ridge encircled a West Mediterranean basin. So sinuous means it has a lot of turns. It's not a straight line. Okay, was occasionally cut off from both, and in late Miocene times was so much reduced by evaporation that none of its deposits of that age are now above water level. There was therefore ample means a lot, communication between the new mid-Europe and the Moroccan lobe of old Africa. The East Mediterranean long retained much of the character of its predecessor, the Midland Sea. So the East Mediterranean was very similar to what it was before. The highland arcs along its northern border included Crete and Cyprus. The Adriatic had not yet sunk outside these arcs, nor the Aegean within them. The mountains of Medea and Elam were still very imperfectly developed, and the Arabian slab of Gondwana land had not yet been fractured or even tilted under their stresses. The southern border of the sea lay therefore far to the southward across Africa, from a Moroccan Gulf south of the Atlas to Abyssinia. Abyssinia is Ethiopia. To Abyssinia, Hadramaut, and the mountain ridge of Oman, with an easterly gulf extending far into Iran. It was separated, however, from all these seas to the southeast as its marine fauna, so fish, remember fauna means animals, so marine fauna would be, marine means water, and fauna means animal, so fish or things that live in the water, animals that live in the water. Show by the ridge already mentioned, connecting the Asiatic with the African continent. Occasionally disconnected from the Atlantic by elevation of the lands round the western basin, it underwent repeated phases of evaporation, and Indo-African plants and animals still occupied its northern margins, leaving their remains, for example, in Samos and Attica. They keep mentioning evaporation, which is when water disappears. So a lot of these places had periods when all of the water would disappear, go into the air. The northern or Sarmatian Sea had similar, though separate, history. It extended repeatedly far east to Lake Balkhash and to the foothills of the Altai and Tian Shan. Maybe we should be looking at pictures of this. So let me find Sarmatian Sea and see if we can find a map or something. Just so it's, because, you know, they're describing it in very big detail, but it's hard to picture because it's like too much detail, actually. So this, I guess, is the Sarmatian Sea, or what it looked like at that period. So the northern or Sarmatian Sea had similar, Though separate history, it extended repeatedly far east to Lake Balkhash and the foothills of the Altai and Tian Shan, and far north round the base of the Urals. An old ridge accentuated by the same tertiary stresses as the mountain zone which bounded this basin on the south. Caucasus was sometimes insulated, but usually formed part of its southern margin with only gulfs or lakes outflanking it southward. Westward communication with the Atlantic was interrupted earlier, oftener, and more completely than in the Mediterranean area, thanks to the growing intimacy between mid-Europe and those ridges and stacks of old land which have been embedded in the Laurentian foreshore. Oh gosh, it's just so complicated, but they're just describing the geography or geology of the area. Between the rising Alps and the Bohemian and mid-German highlands, a long gulf remained, or in high and dry periods, a drainage basin, which may already call Danubian, but the strong northward and outward bulge of the Carpathians eventually cut off the lowlands in the sunken Hungarian basin to form inland lakes. So they're talking about the movement or disappearance of water and how lakes and rivers started to be formed because of the stress of these ridges. That's my interpretation of this. Okay, an outlet through the iron gates of the Pontic Basin cannot be demonstrated until later. As the land masses of mid-Europe and also of North Africa and Western Asia increased in extent, the climate of the whole region became drier. The Sarmatian seas shrank into the Pontic series of lakes connected by flood channels, if at all, but including then a region so far to the southwest, as the present North Aegean. Eventually, one of the deep river valleys was dissected, the exposed Samaritan seafloor cut back into the high ground, and the re-entrant angle between the Carpathians and the Balkans opened a new outlet for the waters of the Hungarian and Bavarian basins already mentioned, and created the Danubian drainage system. In this period, as a long trough faulted across mid-Europe determined the upper basin of the eventual Rhine, though it was long before this lakeland was tapped, like the Danubian, by a river cutting back from the north through the old Taunus highland, from Koblenz to Bingen. The same period of uprise in continental climate affected the Mediterranean also. The rise escarpment of Medea and Elam cut off its Iranian Gulf, which became silted. First with river deposits, then with waters evaporated, with a crust of salt and gypsum. I've mentioned, what was that word? They had a word here I want to look at. Escarpment. I don't know what I've heard that word before, but I don't know what it is. Escarpment. Let's see. Oh, let's just find the definition first. Escarpment. A long, steep slope. So here's an escarpment. Kind of like a cliff. I wonder what the difference between a cliff and an escarpment is. Okay. Oh, they also mentioned gypsum. They've mentioned this a couple of times. I know that that's something that you use for growing plants. I guess maybe it's like very. Uh, oh no, it's not what I thought at all. It looks like a type of crystal. That's strange because I remember that word gypsum is used for plants. Well, let's see what the definition of gypsum is. Soft, white or gray mineral consisting of hydrated calcium sulfate. It occurs chiefly in sedimentary deposit. It's used to make plaster of Paris and fertilizers, and in the building industry. Okay, as the folded escarpment rose, very steep and lofty, the foreland in front of it, to the south, to the southwest. Uh-oh, I've gone blurry. Let me fix myself here. There we go. Okay. Okay, the foreland in front of it to the southwest was forced down and under till the great quadrangular slab, which we call Arabia, was snapped off from Africa and tilted bodily downwards at the foot of the new Zagros range. So they're describing the formation of the Arabian Peninsula. But with a free broken edge upreared to westward in long troughs of dislocation and subsidence between itself and the African continent, the Red Sea trough opened for long into the Mediterranean, like the Nile trough to the west of it, but was closed as its south end by the main ridge from Asia to East Africa. Further north, the same fractures crossed the Mediterranean floor, so that the free edge of the Arabian slab, or rather the detached strip of it which forms the Lebanon range, was thenceforward the eastward limit of the sea. They're just describing the boundaries of the sea. The movement, violent as it appears in retrospect, was, however, gradual and progressed from south to north, so that the drainage basin formed the tilted slab, remained connected with the Mediterranean through North Syria and the Jordan Valley, lying in a smaller, earlier rift, that of the Red Sea, for long a tributary of a great river system of northeastern Africa. Still contains species in common with the Nile and the Euphrates, but in time, Mesopotamia too became a separate basin, like Iran, accumulating its own river sediments, in dry periods its beds of salt and gypsum. The gradual coherence of new land masses where the Tethys Basin had been, and the restricted communication between the remaining seas in the Atlantic, affected the climate of the whole region profoundly and adversely. So adversely means in a bad way. So all of these changes in the land and water formations really changed the weather, the climate, and in a bad way. And the fauna and flora, fauna is animals, flora is plants, were modified accordingly. So, because of these changes, the types of animals and plants that you would find in these areas changed quite a bit, changed a lot. So, surviving representatives of the first occupants of tertiary Europe are now only recognizable in the Malay zoological region. So, are they saying that? I think what they're saying is that the types of animals that you can find in the Malaysian area are the types of animals that maybe you would have found in Europe at that time. That's what it sounds like to me. I don't know. Maybe they'll give more detail. And to some extent in tropical West Africa. So, also the kinds of plants and animals that you find in West Africa would have been also things that you could have found in Europe at that time. For our present purpose, we need only note that it is in these two regions alone that the great anthropoids, gorilla and orangutan, survive. That it is certain that various monkeys and probable that creatures ancestral to man were among these Malayan occupants of mid Europe. That the most simian varieties of man himself, the dwarfish means small, heavy jawed, this is the jaw right here, so big, heavy jaw, long armed negritos, have a similarly discontinuous distribution, surviving only in Central Africa, in Malaya and beyond, and to some extent in southern India. And further, that the only creatures really intermediate between these and the anthropoids are the Pithecanthropus from a deposit considerably later in Java, and the Broken Hill skull from Rhodesia. It's not without reason, therefore, that the search had been made for human handiwork. Handiwork means like crafts, things that people make with their hands. So it is not without reason, therefore, that this search has been made for human handiwork, even in Eocene and Miocene beds. But the eoliths collected in Belgium from the Miocene deposits have not yet been generally accepted as such. So let's see. Eocene, and let's define these. Okay, we've got Eocene meaning. Relating to or denoting the second epoch of the tertiary period. So we're in the tertiary period. It has stages, and Eocene is the second epoch, whatever that means, of the tertiary period. And Miocene, let's see what Miocene is. The fourth period. So the Miocene period is the fourth period of the fourth epoch of the tertiary period. Okay, so let's go back and read this again. Let's see, where do we stop? Or where's a good place to start again? Between these and the anthropoids are Pithecanthropus from a deposit considerably later in Java and the Broken Hill skull from Rhodesia. It is not without reason, therefore, that search has been made for human handiwork, even in Eocene and Miocene beds. So they look for things that humans made, even in these periods, the epochs, the Miocene epoch, and which I think was at the third epoch, and the Miocene is the Miocene is the fourth epoch, and I think what was the other one? Eocene was the third epoch. So they look for things that humans made in these epochs because they think that human like creatures existed during this period. But the eoliths collected in Belgium, let's see what an eolith is. Eolith. Roughly chipped flint found in tertiary strata. Let's see if we can find a picture of an eolith. So it's like an arrowhead. Let's see. That's an eolith. So the eoliths collected in Belgium from the Miocene deposits have not yet been generally accepted as such. Those from gravels lining the sides of present Nile Valley are rather better attested, but must still be viewed with reserve. So let's see. Let's take a look at a Belgian eolith. Maybe some people think that it's something made by a human, but it's, yeah, it could just be a rock or something. So here's a Belgian eolith. It isn't maybe obvious that it was made by a human. Maybe it wasn't. There's some dispute about it. So they don't really accept this as evidence of human activity. But they say, what was it? The ones found in the Nile Valley are more obvious. So let's see. Let's try to find a Nile Valley eolith. See what the difference is. Well, I don't see how that's more obvious, but whatever. Let's see if there's another picture. Maybe, well, there isn't much. There isn't much information about this. Eoliths from France. Eoliths. Oh, I don't know. There aren't a lot of pictures of it, surprisingly. Okay. But whatever they are, or however they look, I guess they're considered more representative of something that a human made. As the climate became less favorable, the Malayan fauna, so the Malayan animals, gave place in the Northwest to characteristically African types, which persisted in the new European, or rather Eurafrican region, which until the close of the Pontic stage. Wait a minute, what? Which persisted in the new European, or rather Eurafrican region, until the close of the Pontic stage. Then, rather abruptly, which means very quickly or unexpectedly, and very widely, this African fauna, these African type of animals, was itself replaced by new forms, distinctly Arctic, advancing apparently from that Laurentian continent, which had existed all the while west of Britain, and probably had extended also far eastward beyond Scandinavia as the Sarmatian Sea evaporated, since similar Arctic forms can be traced penetrating Asia too, as far as its Himalayan crest. So you see all these tropical African-style animals, but then suddenly and unexpectedly, there's a big change, and suddenly you see these Arctic cold weather style animals. I think we're talking about Europe. I've lost track. But suddenly you see these, and it's probably because this other sea, the Sarmatian Sea, started evaporating. The water started going down. So these animals were able to move down into Europe and even into the Himalayas. The African withdrawal was, of course, gradual and unequal. So these animals disappeared very slowly and not in a pattern that you could recognize. Typical forms survived in Bessarabia, for instance, later than elsewhere, and Spitsbergen and Greenland still had magnolias and plane trees during the Pontic phase. What is the Pontic phase? Pontic phase. Geology. I can't really get a definition. Pontic stage. The lower stage of the Pliocene series of the Black Sea and Caspian basins represented by limestone. Okay. It's a stage. I don't really know. Okay, it's a stage. The Pontic phase. Within the folded zone especially, there were secluded regions of favorable to the survival of the old warmth-loving forms. The progressive folding of mature mountain ranges and the development of more recent folds, such as the Apennines and the Jura, accentuated this subdivision of northwestern Eurafrican landmass. A fresh period of submergence follows, probably due to relaxation of the folding stresses and collapse of ill-supported blocks. So remember, when you see that word ill in front of something, it means not done in a good way, done in a poor way, done in a bad way. So if the blocks are ill-supported, then you can expect that maybe they will fall at some point. And that's what they say, the collapse of the ill-supported blocks. So these blocks, these were stones or something standing, but they were not standing in a very stable way, and eventually they fell. They were ill-supported. The British promontory of Laurentia and probably the whole southern seaboard of that continent began to give way, so that the Atlantic Ocean, which had long ago been extended southwards from Tethys to the Antarctic, spread northwards now into cooler latitudes. Since some of these sinking areas, for example, the Aquitanian region of France, adjoined the West Mediterranean, Atlantic marine fauna. Again, fauna means animals, so marine fauna means animals that live in the water, had access once more to the Mediterranean basins. As the water surface of these seats increased, the climate became moister, and the weathering of the highlands and main river valleys more destructive. So the weather became worse and more humid. It's in this period that the drainage systems of the Lower Rhine, the Seine, and other rivers of the English Channel, the Loire, Garonne, Guadalquivir, and the Wadi Dra of the Moroccan Atlas were established in deep-lying gulfs. The Rhone is another example of drainage consequent on such subsidence. Further east, the Aegean Depression, already noted, began to admit Mediterranean waters to basins hitherto belonging to the Pontic lake system. The Pontic region, too, receiving ample rainfall once more, regained its old continuity from the Carpathians as far as Lake Baikal. The trough valley of the Nile was being opened, as we have already seen, as far as the Aswan, Aswan. Maybe that's Aswan. That's like a. Oh, I think now we spell it differently, but I think that's Aswan. And received copious drainage from the high west edge of the Arabian slab. The first fractures had begun along the line of the Red Sea, and the remains of considerable lakes in the Dead Sea and Orontes regions suggest similar subsidences further north. The Mesopotamian basin was by this time quite cut off from the Mediterranean by the tilting of Arabia. Though the barrier from Lebanon northward was of no great width or height, when the tilting movement came to a crisis and Arabia broke away from the African continent, the Red Sea trough opened, first as a gulf of the Mediterranean, but the foundering of the next block, so that foundering is like failure or the breaking apart of the next block south of Arabia admitted the waters of the Indian Ocean into the Gulf from the south. And a similar inbreak through the Hormuz Strait converted the Mesopotamian lake, which had formed along the sunk eastern edge of Arabia, into a Persian Gulf of the same southern ocean, extending all along the foothills of Zagros, and also towards Anti-Taurus and Anti-Lebanon. In this fashion, while the Mediterranean remained limited eastward almost at its present shoreline, the whole region between it and the Iranian plateau became almost wholly separate from what remained of old Gondwana land, both in peninsular India and in East Africa, with a new and narrow isthmus twice constricted as Suez and north of Lebanon, at Suez and north of Lebanon, instead of the old broad land avenue from Iran to Abyssinia. So Abyssinia is Ethiopia. And isthmus, let's take a look at an isthmus. Isthmus. It's like a thin piece of land. Let's see. Here's an isthmus. This is in Central America. So every time you have this kind of thin piece of land in a body of water, you can call that an isthmus. That's an isthmus. Mexico, isthmus. There's a nice picture of an isthmus here. Merry Isthmus. Well, they really just show Central America as an example of an isthmus, but I guess it's a good example. Okay. Well, let's go back. Oh, I've lost my place. Well, maybe I think I'll stop here because we've been going for 3 hours now. My voice is tired. So I will continue this next time. We're still on chapter 1 of Cambridge Ancient History. It's very long. It's a very long history, very detailed. I'm not explaining too much because it's very tedious. I think when we get to when they start talking about human history, that's when we can really go into more detail about things. But right now, it's almost meaningless to talk about these things that you have to picture in your head, directions and land masses and heights and things like that. So we'll probably read through this more quickly with less explanation, because it's just I don't think it would be very entertaining to try to take this apart. But we'll continue it next time. All right. Until next time, goodbye.